The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
It's coming.
All these voices. All these voices. All these things you can't explain. All these painful memories. They keep haunting you and daunting me. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a ghost of you and me. Of you and me. All these whispers.
My name is James Hershey.
In the rain.
Right back.
All these shadows in my mind. With my reflection I can't find. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a
I know how to
ghost
do
of
it.
you and me. Of you and me. Don't let 'em take you away. Don't let 'em bring you down inside. It's just the mirrors in your mind. Don't let 'em bring you down.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Staring into the Abyss. I am your host, horror author James Hershey Jr., and as always, with me is old boy James Ash, my co-host. How you doing, brother?
Pretty good. Good evening, sugar ladies, misfits, and demon hunters.
Tonight, we are going to be talking about probably the greatest unsolved murder mystery of all time. We're going to be talking about Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is a strange case because there was a whole bunch of murders. Anywhere from the 5 accepted Jack the Ripper murders, there's a larger list of 11 that most people agree could have been Jack the Ripper. And some people go all the way up to 15 or all the way up to even, I've seen 38 different murders that might have been committed by Jack the Ripper. They're not exactly sure. That's because of the way that Whitechapel was in that time period. I'll get to that here in a minute. Jack the Ripper, nobody knows who he really was. There's a lot of different theories. He was known in most of the reports of the day as the Whitechapel murderer. Some people also called him Leather Apron, which really doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I guess it probably made sense back then. The term Jack the Ripper, that actually came from a media report from the time. That was a supposed letter that Jack the Ripper had written to the media. But most experts agree that that letter was most likely a forgery that was written by journalists to try to spice up the story a little bit and sell papers, basically. Same stuff that the media does nowadays. They just kind of make stuff up. Whitechapel was a district in London. These murders took place in 1888, and they stretched from 88 to 91, 92, depending on which accounts you believe of as far as which murders were actually from Jack the Ripper, and some of them most likely were from other people. Jack the Ripper targeted female prostitutes that were from the slums in the East End of London. He cut their throats, and then after he had cut their throats, he sliced open their abdominal area, and he mutilated the hell out of them. He cut their organs out. There's 3 confirmed victims that had surgical removals of organs, and that led authorities to believe that he was either a surgeon or a doctor or somebody that had some kind of medical training in order to be able to perform those operations, because the way they were cut out, It wasn't like he just sliced these chicks open and ripped them out. You know what I mean? It was a clean incision, most likely made with a scalpel or a very sharp knife that was like a scalpel. It was a clean incision, and the organs were very carefully and surgically removed precisely so as not to damage the organs. It wasn't like a crime of passion like rage where he would just slice into them and just hack them up and yank the organs out. They were surgically removed. At first they didn't know what was going on. At first they didn't realize that they were dealing with a serial killer here. They thought that it was just a bad couple murders. They started to realize that the murders were connected around September or October of 1888. And that's when the letters started coming in to the different media outlets, and they were also sent to Scotland Yard. The famous From Hell letter that movie with Johnny Depp was made from was received by George Lusk. He was a member of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. And with that letter, Jack the Ripper actually sent like half of a kidney in with the letter. And it was supposedly from one of the victims. And that's how they knew that they were dealing with something way more than just somebody killing prostitutes for the fun of it. You know what I mean? Because at that time, it was a very, very, how should I put this diplomatically? A very rough place. In the mid-1850s, 60s, you started having a lot of Irish that would come in and immigrate into that area. And then later on, you had a lot of the Russian and the Eastern European Jews that were migrating in. And they all went throughout the city, but they mainly concentrated in that Whitechapel area, okay, on the east end of London. And what happened was it caused that area to get very overpopulated. So you had really crowded situation there with living conditions, and sanitation at that time wasn't the greatest. So with that influx of a whole lot of people, you had a whole lot of garbage, a whole lot of crap, a whole lot of urine, that kind of thing. Put people in a foul mood. With all those immigrants also, you had a lack of jobs, a lack of opportunity for these people when they got here. So it all kind of worked together to form a perfect storm. And at that point in time, there was a lot of different violent attacks that were going on in Whitechapel. It was not out of the ordinary for women to be murdered in the streets, because a lot of these women that came in had no way to feed their families, and they turned to prostitution to put food on the table, basically, and to make sure they had a roof over their heads. And there was quite a number of them. So it was almost like that old thing where there's like a prostitute on every corner,
It was 1 out of 6 what I read out of 900,000 people in the West End. So I mean,
there
the
you
East
go.
End. I just wanted.
So that's a lot.
You know.
That's a lot. So you had a lot of prostitutes that were out, and it was very common for there to be assaults, different attacks, rapes, robberies, and even murders. They would have a lot of stabbings, a lot of murders that would go on as well. So a lot of the victims that sometimes get attributed to Jack the Ripper may not have been Jack the Ripper. There was a couple that happened before the main 5 that everybody talks about. The first one, the lady was stabbed like 39 times, savagely. And at first they attributed that to Jack the Ripper in the case files, but later on they decided it wasn't Jack the Ripper because there was no like surgical precision and all that. It was just a horrific crime. So most likely a different person. There was a lot after those 5 that everybody talks about as well, but they didn't exactly fit the MO. You know what I mean? They were a little bit different here and there. So I don't know. It's kind of funny how they do that, because at that time they didn't have the forensic capabilities that they have now. So they just kind of had to go on patterns and similarities between the murders to decide what was what. The 5 victims that everybody agrees were victims of Jack the Ripper were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Ketty. Those are the 5 that everybody talks about is definitely Jack the Ripper's victims. And they all had some similarities. In every one of the cases, the woman's throat was slit with a couple horizontal slices across her throat. And then the body was opened up and different pieces were taken out. Nichols was the first. Her body was discovered on August 31st, 1888, which is actually my brother's birthday. It was discovered in Bucks Row. That's Durward Street now in Whitechapel. Her throat was severed by 2 cuts, and the lower part of the abdomen was partially ripped open by a deep and jagged wound. Now, this is different than some of the later ones. So the authorities thought that even though the wound wasn't as clean as some of the later wounds, they thought since it was in the same basic area and the same kind of things were going on with this murder, they figured it was the first one that Jack the Ripper did, because he was just learning how to do it properly and he got better as he went along. Chapman was found on the 8th of September in 1888. She was found in a doorway on Hanbury Street. And same thing as with Nichols, the throat was sliced with 2 cuts. But this time the abdomen was slashed completely open. I mean, like completely wide open. And Jack the Ripper had removed the uterus of Chapman, and I guess took it with him. Stride and Eddowes were killed at the same time, basically, in the early morning of September 30th in 88. Stride's body was found at 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard. That's off Burner Street, which is now Henrik Street in Whitechapel. And she had one clear-cut incision on the left side of her neck that had severed the artery there and caused her to bleed out. There was no mutilations to her abdomen, and they didn't know whether they should actually credit Jack the Ripper with her murder or not. What they thought was maybe because there was 2 murders that day, they thought maybe she was the first, and somebody came along and saw him and interrupted it, and he didn't get to do his whole ritual of making the incision in the stomach and taking a trophy and all that. So he just kind of ran away, and they think that maybe that's why there was a second murder that day of Eddowes. And she was found in Mitre Square in London about 45 minutes after Stride. So they're thinking that less than an hour passed after the first murder that the second took place. Her throat was also severed, but this time her abdomen was opened up by a long, deep wound. The left kidney was removed, and the majority of the uterus was removed again from this victim as well. A guy named Joseph Lawand, who was a local there, had been passing through the square with a couple of friends right before the murder happened. And he actually gave the first description that the police had of Jack the Ripper, of the murderer. He said that it was a fair-haired man of a shabby appearance who was with a woman who may have been Eddowes. They weren't sure whether it was her or not, but they thought it's very possible that it could have been. So that was the first description that the police had to go by to see what Jack the Ripper might have looked like. Kelly was found in her room at Miller's Court off Dorset Street on Friday the 9th of November in 88. This was different than the other murders because they had been found out in the street or in doorways or something like that. This woman was found in her room. Her throat had been severed, but this time it was a much deeper wound. The wound actually went all the way down to the spinal cord. And her abdomen was severed as well, all the way down to the spinal cord. And it was emptied of pretty much all of its organs. There was very little left inside of her. And this time, Jack the Ripper also took her heart. This told police that not only was he getting better at his craft, but that there was some changes taking place in his pattern. Because instead of killing out in the street, he actually went to this woman's room and killed her. They theorized that this way he had a lot more time, so he removed all of the parts that he wanted. Now, it's possible that Jack the Ripper had always intended, with all of his victims, to remove all those organs. But he just never had the time. Whether it was because he heard somebody coming and had to leave, such as the case of the first murder of the double murder day, or maybe he just got a little spooked because he was out in public and he didn't want to take too much time. But this showed that Jack the Ripper was evolving, because he actually went into the woman's room where he had privacy and he had the time that he needed to perform his ritual exactly how he wanted to perform it. It also showed a lot more aggression coming from Jack the Ripper, because the wounds were much deeper than they ever were before. Instead of just severing the arteries in the neck and causing the woman to die, this time he had went all the way down to the spinal cord, almost decapitating the woman. So that showed an increase in intensity and rage. There's no logical reason to make such deep cuts in the neck. I mean, that has to come because he's losing control. And as we know from many serial killer cases throughout history, that's usually when they get caught. They start to get reckless, and they begin to lose control, and they're not as careful. And the urge increases in frequency, and the rage increases in ferocity. And that's when they usually make a mistake. All 5 of these murders were committed at night, and they were either during the weekend or really close to the weekend, like on a Friday. And they were at the end of the month, or like close to the end of the month, like within a few days. This is also a useful bit of information, because this tells you that the person that was committing these crimes was most likely somebody who worked during the day and was free at night. Like the majority of the population at that time, honestly. But it is a data point. It also tells you the same thing because it's the weekend, okay, or in the end of the month. That's telling you that not only is it a person that probably works during the week, so they're doing this on the weekends, but it also opens up another possibility, because on the weekend, on Friday and Saturday night, much like today, that is the time when entertainment begins to happen, okay? When you will have musicians come in, you will have plays going on, you will have celebrities of the time plying their trade. That's going to happen on the weekends. So that opens up a whole nother suspect list of potential people that could have been Jack the Ripper. They say that there's like over 100 suspects for who Jack the Ripper is. I have my personal belief on who Jack the Ripper is, and we'll get to that in the second half of the show. I believe that this case has been solved. I believe that I know who Jack the Ripper is, and I will let you know who that is, and I will actually tell you the evidence that I have to try to prove it. Depending on who you believe, if you believe that a lot of those other victims belong to Jack the Ripper, then it's very possible that there were many more murders that took place. But he didn't follow the exact same MO as he followed in these 5 murders. Some of them had the throat cut, some of them had, the body cavity opened up, sometimes organs were missing, sometimes they weren't. But it wasn't the same kind of ritual. That tells us a couple things. Either one, it wasn't Jack the Ripper that was committing these murders. It could have been a copycat. That happened then just like it happens now. But the copycat didn't know all the details, so he was just trying to make it look like Jack the Ripper, but it wasn't. It could have been that Jack the Ripper did commit some of those other murders, but whatever he was trying to accomplish was accomplished within the 5. So he changed the way he did things. That doesn't happen very often with serial killers, but it's not unheard of. If they believe that they are on some grandiose quest, or they have to to complete some sort of ritual for whatever reason, whether it's witchcraft or whether it's some kind of delusion that they have based on religion or magic or something. If they believe that they need to complete a ritual in a certain way, and then they are able to do that, like he did with that last murder, then maybe he moved on and just started killing for the fun of it and not having to worry so much about sticking to a particular method of doing things. It's possible. Is it probable? I would say probably not. But it is always possible. But if you believe that those 5 murders were the Jack the Ripper murders, and all the other murders that people are talking about were committed either by copycats or by just random violence that happened all the time anyway at that time in Whitechapel. Because like I said at the beginning of the show, there was a lot of murders that were going on then. If you believe that those 5 were it, then you have to ask yourself what happened to Jack the Ripper. Did he get caught? No, we know he didn't get caught because they were still, to this day, trying to figure out who it is. Did he die of natural causes? That's possible. Was he killed by some random act of violence that took place in Whitechapel? I would say probably not. He could have died from some act of violence, but I doubt very seriously it was in Whitechapel. And the reason I say that is because Whitechapel at that time was a slum. It was the ghetto. I mean, plain and simple. It was the worst part of town. The person who committed these murders was not a ghetto person. The person that committed these murders had an education. He had surgical skills. He had knowledge of anatomy. He looked for certain organs and took them time after time. That tells me it was an educated person. Most likely a doctor or a surgeon or somebody with those kind of skill sets that could do this. So the chances of that person getting killed in Whitechapel are slim because he wouldn't be there unless he was hunting prostitutes, basically. Could he have just moved away? Could he have thought, hey, I got away with something here. I better get while the getting's good, while I still can, let me get the hell out of here. That's a very good possibility. In fact, I think that's exactly what happened. The person that I believe is Jack the Ripper. Actually, before I tell you who I believe is Jack the Ripper, let's go to Old Boy and let's hear about some of the other people that are the prime suspects that a lot of people believe it could be, and hear a couple other tidbits from Old Boy about Jack the Ripper, and then we'll get to who I think it is. So, Old Boy, you go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, brother. Well, just remember, guys, I believe there's more than one person because that's just my opinion because what I've read on. And I was moving this weekend, so I only got a little bit, but I've studied him because, the In Hell movie with Johnny Depp, I seen that. You got to realize in the 1800s, around that time when we were talking about the prostitution, that wasn't looked down upon. It was actually all right because at that time, it was so bad that the women did it so they could get money to feed their families. Like, it would be 3 pennies. Back then, 3 pennies bought a stale piece of bread or milk or whatever. So, but it was like doing a job. So, out of 900,000, it was a slum. On the east side, I think it is, or East End, whatever the hell it is. But Jack the Ripper I think he had a hate for women. I mean, that's just obvious. I think something happened where he was killing prostitutes because this person didn't care about women too much, and he had some knowledge of, like he said, surgeon. He was either a doctor or a surgeon. I also think there was more than one person. There's, and one of them was the hairdresser. God, I can't say his last name. Aaron Kokowski. He was an immigrant, Jewish immigrant that was around the 1860s. But that's one of the main people they think did. I'll read it right now. It's hard to say his name. Komakowski. If he was a Polish Jew, and he came from Poland, he was Russian in the 1880 in the early 1880s. I think it was, and then John Dorwit. I think is another one was a college grad. John Dort, that's how you say it, a Winchester College sportsman. he ended up getting killed. So he was found in a river, drowned. But they thought it might have been him. He was a lot of people's favorite suspect, but he was ended up being found in December 31st, 1888. And that's why, but I guess the murders were going all the way to 1891 or 90. And then stuff happened after that. Like he said there was a guy who sent a paper with a kidney, half a kidney, was supposed to be Jack the Ripper. There's so many stories of who it could be. And there's so many other murders they think it was. They think there's 5, like you were saying, the 5 women who were killed. Nichols, I think it's Kathleen, Elizabeth, Mary Jane Kelly, and then Anna Chapman, Mary Ann Nichols. They were all murdered by him. And there's other ones they think he did. There's more. I think he did about at least, I'd say about 20. They think he did more than that, but I think that there's a chance he did more. He killed more than that, but some people are going to argue it. And some people say like he thinks that he thinks it's one person. I don't. I think there was more than one person. I think there was quite a few. I think it was at least 2. I think he had an accomplice because, like he said, there was a murder at 2 different times, an hour between each other, and I think that that he had an accomplice, and I think that they were both killers. But some people are going to argue with me on that. So there's a couple other guys too. There's like I said, like 100 people, but the story has always been intriguing because the guy just had no respect for any kind of anybody. I mean, women especially. Like what he did to women was like cutting them open and dismembering them and taking body parts and especially their female organs. So, I mean, he also cut their breast too on one of them. He was just a very violent person, and it just baffles me how somebody could be that evil. And I just think that it was somebody who was just did not care about the poor and just basically just butchered, didn't like hookers. And I think there was a reason for that. I think something had happened in the past that he got a prostitute, and either something happened or he just snapped, or maybe he was with somebody that ended up being a prostitute and he ended up losing it and hating prostitutes. But I really believe there was more than one person. I believe there was 2, maybe even a group of people who were just back then. I think there was a group of people that had money that didn't care about the poor then and did nasty things, and they always do. They still do it to this day and do very nasty things to our poor. And because they just don't care. No one's going to care if some prostitute, people do care, but back then a lot of people don't care about a prostitute that, it barely makes a living, and they're just taking space. Back then they didn't care. A lot of people thought that way. I don't agree with it, but that's how some people think. So I really believe this guy he had something that happened in his past where he hated women so bad. Like I said, I haven't really studied a lot about Jack the Ripper. I know the stories, and I know he's probably one of the most famous serial killers ever. If they ever caught him, I don't believe they ever caught him. I believe he was that good. I mean, you have every story, the In Hell movie, then you got movies and documentaries, and I think they also made video games. He also was in Sherlock Holmes like a year later. I think before that Sherlock Holmes came out, and I think they even had him in the story. One of the books about Jack the Ripper. So, it's a very intriguing story. I have read there's at least about 60 people they think killed these women, and I think there's more than one. But we're going to hear in a couple minutes what James's opinion is on who he thinks, and he thinks he's got the evidence and who killed them. And I wouldn't mind hearing this because I've heard so many different people there is. So right now they're saying it's some Alex guy who's the one that killed him. So, I mean, I would love to know who it is. Go ahead, Hirsch.
The idea that because there was two murders on the same day, there's more than one person. The reason I don't buy that, the reason I think that it was one guy, is because there was 45 minutes in between the first and second murders. And the murders took place literally a few blocks from each other. So it wasn't like it was impossible to cover that distance in an hour. He had plenty of time to cover that distance, find another victim, and do what he wanted to do. You see what I'm saying? So I think that could easily be done by one person. So that's why I believe that it was one instead of a group. I do agree with you, however, that he was never caught. Okay, and so now for the moment where I tell everybody who Jack the Ripper was, in my opinion. I believe that Jack the Ripper was a painter, an English painter named Walter Sickert. Okay? Sickert was born in Germany, but he moved to England when he was 6. He was married 3 times, and he died in Bath in 1942. He was 81 years old when he died. He's kind of famous for painting a portrait of Winston Churchill. And he's the guy that I think killed the original 5. Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. That's who I think killed those 5. And I think potentially even up to 15 more in the 1880s. Possibly. Some of those other murders could have been committed by this guy. But I think that being an artist, I think he was trying to create a masterpiece of his own in his own sick way. I think that's what the mutilations were about. I think that's what taking the different organs was about. He had some grand masterpiece in his mind that he was trying to create. And with that last murder, he was able to fulfill that because he was in the woman's room and he had the time and he could do it the way he wanted to do it. And then I think maybe like a lot of creative people, he went on to other projects and maybe he did commit some of these other murders that kind of strung along. But I mean, I don't think he was ever caught. Obviously, if it was this guy who I think it was, he was never caught. Now, some of the evidence, if you look at some of Sickert's paintings, okay, and you can Google this guy. If you go on Google and you type in Walter Sickert, Walter's easy to spell. I'll spell out Sickert for you. It's Sickert. If you look at some of his paintings, then you will see similarities between his paintings and the murders that took place. Okay, he has a painting called Putana a Casa, and it shows a prostitute that has black brushstrokes across her face and neck, which line up pretty close to the cuts on Catherine Eddowes on her face and neck. He had a painting in 1906 called Les Journaux. It shows a woman wearing a tight necklace, and her head is thrown back, and her mouth is wide open. Okay, that painting is almost identical to the photo of Eddowes that has her neck cut open. He had another painting called Summer Night where it replicates Mary Kelly's death, the one that happened in the room on the bed. Her death is replicated in the painting Summer Night. Now that's kind of circumstantial. I mean, one of his paintings is even hanging in Scotland Yard, and it shows a frightened woman, like a really scared looking woman, and she has like a strange band around her neck, which could also symbolize the slitting of the throat. So that's one bit of evidence that is really strange to me. It really sticks out. Another bunch of evidence is his writing is very, very similar, almost identical actually, to the letters that were sent by Jack the Ripper to the press. Not the one where he calls himself Jack the Ripper, because that one was basically a fake. But Jack the Ripper did send many letters to the press. He just didn't call himself Jack the Ripper in them. Both Sickert's letters and Jack the Ripper's letters, they had like strange little doodles and little characters that he would draw, little people and stuff, scattered among the text of the letter. He mailed a postcard to James Fraser, who was the commissioner of the London police, and Jack the Ripper drew a cartoon head that had a cut throat. That happened right after the murder of Annie Chapman. She had her throat down and slit, like I said earlier. That cartoon face that Jack the Ripper sent to the commissioner, it is almost identical to a doodle that Sickert did on a letter that he wrote in 1893 to another artist named William Rothenstein, something like that. I forget the exact last name. I think it's Rothenstein. That doodle is almost identical to the doodle that Jack the Ripper did in his letter to the police commissioner. Now, for whatever reason, Sickert was protected at that time, and to some extent even now his memory is being protected. He was given an alibi at that time, but that alibi it just doesn't hold up. You know, I'll get into a little bit more on that here in a minute. But not only did you have the doodles, okay, but you also had a little bit of science that was done. They analyzed the paper that the letters were written on, that Jack the Ripper letters were written on, the ones that were sent to the police, and they analyzed the paper from some of Sickert's known writings. Okay, now this is where it gets good. This is where it goes beyond circumstantial into real evidence. On all of those letters, they had 3 letters from Sickert that they analyzed, and 2 of the Jack the Ripper letters that were sent to police. Those 3 Sickert letters and the 2 Ripper letters came from the exact same run of paper, and it was like 24 sheets that they ran. Those letters came from the same roll. We know that because the roll of paper had a unique watermark. Each roll of paper that was printed at that time had a unique watermark with numbers letting you know which roll it was. So they were actually able to trace the Jack the Ripper letters and the Sickert letters to the exact same roll of paper because the watermarks were identical. What that tells you is that that paper was bought at the same time because it was together. The mistake that Sickert made was using the same letter that he wrote his letters on in his real life to write the Jack the Ripper letters. He didn't consider the watermark. If he hadn't been protected at that time, then we wouldn't have a mystery today, I believe. But there was something more that was protecting Sickert from prosecution. Another bit of evidence is Sickert had an illegitimate son. The guy's name was Joseph Gorman. Joseph Gorman said that Sickert confessed that he was Jack the Ripper and went into great detail about the murders that he committed. A lot of people said that he wasn't his son, but he actually inherited Sickert's publishing royalties after he died in 1942. So if he wasn't his son, even if he was illegitimate, which he was, but if he wasn't his son, why would Sickert leave all of his royalties to him? To me, that says that he was. Sickert was, at that time of the murders, he was named a suspect. Okay, this isn't just a modern interpretation. He is actually on the suspect list. When they named him as a suspect, a lot of the powerful people in the art scene and everything, they rallied around him, and they said, no, it couldn't have been him. He has his alibi. He was in France when the murders were taking place, so he couldn't have done it. Okay, so that made the police not look at him anymore. The problem is, that alibi doesn't hold up, because there are dated sketches that put him in London at the time of the murders. He was in London in the music halls during at least 3 of the killings. And that's 3 that we can document. I'm pretty sure the other 2 he was doing the same thing. We just don't have paperwork on it. So the fact that he was given a false alibi that we can prove is false, because those sketches exist that were dated and they tell where they're at. We know that he was not in France during these murders. He was actually in London. So he very easily could have committed these murders. The sketches that we have are dated August, September, and November. Okay? Mary Kelly, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. Those were the murders that took place during the time of those sketches. Within a day of those sketches, the murder took place, each one of those. So very, very probable that it could have been him doing that. They said he was in France. Not true. Now, that is the evidence that points to him. He was an educated person, so he would have had knowledge of anatomy. Also, being an artist, he would have studied anatomy to be able to paint the human body, because he did portraits of people. So he would know some anatomy from that as well. So it is possible that he could have done the mutilations and taken and harvested the organs for whatever purpose. I believe the purpose was he was trying to create some grand work of art for an audience of one. Or maybe an audience of more than one. Maybe that's why the elites of the art world gave him a false alibi. Maybe, like Old Boy was saying, there was more than one man. Maybe it was a group that he was creating some horrific, sick art for them to enjoy. We see that even nowadays with like the Illuminati and people like that.
Yep.
They do horrifying things in the name of entertainment and art. They are into crazy stuff. They do all these weird rituals and weird stuff, and they're all those artsy-fartsy kind of people. So it's very possible that the reason why he was protected is because maybe he was a member of the Illuminati, or at least close to members of the Illuminati, and they were protecting him. Those are the only people I can think of that would have had the power at that time period to protect him, other than the government of England, which we know the government's not going to be protecting him because it caused quite an uproar, the murders, and it was in their best interest to solve them because it was making Scotland Yard look stupid. Okay, and Scotland Yard was representing the government. So we know it wasn't the government that was covering this up. So it had to have been somebody that had the power to cover it up. You see what I'm saying? And to me, that just speaks to Illuminati like crazy.
It could be possibility. I think the reason why I was saying it, I think there's more than one person. Though I don't think you got it there. Here's my argument on that, though. They said whoever did it was a surgeon. He wasn't a surgeon. So I mean, and that's where I kind of would argue that one, because he knew what he was doing. So that's why there's an argument that it was that guy. It was a doctor from America you were talking about too, because he was a surgeon. So what I think was going on, and this is a possibility, what I think is, here's where I think there's more than one. I think it was a group of people, like you were saying, like the Illuminati, maybe it was somebody else. Why they never caught this guy is he had some tie-ins with somebody that was in Parliament maybe at the time, or the, Scotland Yard, or even somebody. It comes into where all these people were suspects. Some of these people could be all involved in it. Like that lady's, the Queen's grandson. He had power. It could have been some twisted, like you said, some twisted art they liked. And he had more backing than you think. And that's why he got away with some of the stuff he did. But the only thing I have a problem with this is the way he killed people. He knew how to take out the organs. That's why I'm like, I don't know. It might have been. He might have went to school for that. He might have studied anatomy.
I do have an answer for that.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay? I am a mountain man. I'm not a surgeon. Okay. I'm not a doctor. But I'm a hunter. And I could take out organs as well. Because I gut deer. I gut squirrel. I gut rabbits. I can very easily make the incision and take out any organs I want. I can identify them, what they are, and I can pull them out. Because the physiology of an animal is much the same as the physiology of a human being, at least in structure. Okay, when you're talking internal organs. They have the same stuff we do inside. So anybody that had done butchering, anybody that had done hunting, would have enough knowledge to be able to pull out the organs. We know he was an artist, a painter, which means he had great dexterity in his hands and fingers in order to paint. So he would be able to make the precise cuts. Okay, the idea that he was a surgeon comes from the fact that the organs and stuff were removed. But if you really think about it, anybody that has experience butchering animals could have done the exact same thing. I can open up a human body and I can take the liver out, I can take the kidneys out, I can take the uterus out, I can take any individual piece I want. I can tell you which pieces are good eating and which pieces aren't good eating, because I know from animals what everything looks like, okay, and where everything is. It's the same in human beings. I don't think he necessarily had to have been a surgeon to do it. He just had to have the ability to do it. And I believe that being an artist, he would have had the dexterity in his hands and the precise movements to be able to make the incisions and to be able to remove the organs. I think when you're looking at the way that it was all done, to me it really shouts that it was some sick thing that was going on. It was some sick artistic statement or some sick piece of art that he was creating that was the reasoning behind it. And it's interesting when you throw in the grandson and you throw in, you know, some of the elites in the art world. I mean, we could really be talking here about an Illuminati kill for some kind of ritual purposes. You know what I mean? And you could be talking about multiple different suspects that were all tied in together, that were part of this group, you know, in the Illuminati that was doing this. And then the reason that the murders stopped wasn't because somebody died or somebody got caught. The reason that the murders stopped was because the ritual was over. It was done. They didn't need to kill anybody else at that point. You know what I mean? Because whatever they were trying to accomplish, whatever ritual they were doing, they finished. So to me, it's a very interesting thing. But I honestly do believe that Sickert is the one that killed those 5 women.
But it was always to women. It was never to men, and it was such a gruesome way. There's had to be some other reason. It was never to men. And that's why I'm trying to say there's got to be some other... He had some issue with women, too, It wasn't just, he did it for art, because he did certain things.
Well, that was based
took out
on
their uterus,
sexual dysfunction.
Sex organs, cut their breasts. So he had an issue with it.
That's what that was based on.
Yeah.
Okay. When Sickert was young, he developed a condition with his penis, and it caused him to have. I'm trying to think of a way to put this delicately, because I don't want to say something too terrible on this show. He could not function in the way that a man is supposed to function properly because of the problem that he had when he was younger. It led to a condition which was much worse, and he lost the full use of his penis. And so with sexual dysfunction, that in a mind that's not altogether right, that could definitely form a hatred and a rage against women. And that could very well be why he sliced the breast, why he sliced the face a little bit to make them not so pretty and not so desirable anymore. And that could be why he took the uterus out. You know what I mean? Because since he could not perform sexually, they were never going to perform sexually, even though they were dead. But you get the symbolism there. That very well could explain that. So he fits the bill on that aspect as well, because he could not perform sexually because of what happened to him when he was younger. So that very well could be as well. I mean, that doesn't disqualify him. This has been a very, very interesting show, but it's also been kind of a dark show because we've been talking about horrific and gruesome murder. So I don't want to end it on such a dark and depressing note. Instead, I want to tell you a little story real quick about the song that I'm going to play tonight at the end of this show. Almost everybody that listens to Staring Into the Abyss knows that I make my living as a horror author. I'm an international selling horror author. I've written 4 novels. I wrote the I Am Legion series, and that's where most people know me from. But before I became a horror author, before I started writing novels, I've spent the majority of my life as a musician. I played guitar, I played bass, and I sang. I came up with John Hammond, the guy that does our theme song and I play a lot of his music after our show. We were in many, many bands together. And this story revolves around a time when we were in a band called Trial and Error together. Now, we were doing very well with that band, and we were just finishing up a tour. And we had a week off, and then we were going right back out on tour. Well, we had met a lady at one of our shows, and her name was Destiny Star. And she had cancer, and she was dying. So she came backstage, and we met with the girl. She was a very, very nice lady. And it was a truly heartbreaking story because she wasn't that old, full of life, but she had a death sentence. There was no way she was going to survive it. So we had met with her and talked with her a few times. While we were finishing up our tour, we received word that she did not have very much longer. So we rushed back home, and instead of spreading out to our individual families and spending the time before we went back out, instead we agreed to play a free show for her. They had this get-together at one of her relatives' houses that had a big yard and everything and a big deck. So we set up our equipment on the deck and we played a show there for free for them. And at that show, we debuted a song that we had written. That song was called Destiny Star, and it was a tribute to this wonderful, wonderful lady that we had met. Now, we had no idea when we got there just how sick she really was. She was really not doing well at all. As we arrived and set up the equipment, we saw her in the house, and she could barely get around. But when it was time for the show, they helped her outside so that she could watch us play. I will never, in my entire life, forget playing this song for her for the first time and watching as she swayed back and forth with the music. Tears just rolling down her face. But you could tell by the look that she had that they were not tears of sorrow. For once, she was not feeling sorry for herself. It was tears of joy, tears of happiness, tears of love. That moment in time stays with me to this day. That moment changed something inside of me. It was one of the most beautiful moments I've ever seen in my life. Now, we finished up the show. We gave her a big hug and all that kind of stuff, packed up our equipment, and went to see our families before we had to go back out on the road. We found out before we left for the road again that the day after the show that we put on for her, she had died. She barely made it to the show. It wasn't even a full 24 hours and she was gone. I'm very grateful that we chose to be there for her instead of thinking of ourselves and going home. Because we'd been playing for a while, so we were tired. We were worn out. We needed our family. But we felt such love for this girl that we decided to show up. And I'm glad we did because it really made a memory that I'll never forget. So I'd like to play this song for you guys. And as you listen to it, maybe in your mind you can see this woman swaying back and forth and crying. Just tears of absolute joy. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you for all your support. And until I speak to you again, love many, trust few, and do harm to none. God loves you, and so do we. Enjoy the song, guys. Bye-bye.
Like a desperate lady, she fights and she fights. Like a crazy woman, she tries and she tries.